But next up is another hot, turbulent, volcanic zone in the world, and that is Syria. Many of us might feel that what is happening in Syria, sorry, I'll just wait a moment till everyone settles down. What's happening in Syria may seem of almost no consequence here in India, but Syria is the longest dictatorship that the world has ever seen. It has the longest state of emergency. There is no free media, and there have been terrible massacres there. And the world is still uncertain what to do. Because in many ways, the revolutions in recent time, as we spoke of earlier, has created darker riptides of the rise of conservative forces, and particularly in Syria, the opposition forces to Assad are as disturbing as Assad himself. So today, to speak of the great conundrum of Syria and why it should matter to India is a revolutionary called Ausama Monajed. Osama was forced to leave Syria. He now lives in London. He runs a strategic center. And he has also created, or is the member of the Syrian National Council, which is trying to create, or is a forum that represents all the people that Syrian society is made up of. He's a revolutionary, but he does not bear a gun. He's someone who's been arrested again and again until he finally realized his life was in danger and is now in exile. And he has experienced the prisons in Syria, which are 2 by 3 feet, and where there is extreme torture. Earlier, one of our speakers said that if you hear of things, you see things, you know of things, and you don't respond, then we are complicit. Much of our gathering here is to make us less and less complicit in all that we know about but refuse to get involved with. Speaking to him is Vishnu, senior editor of NDTV. Do welcome Ausama and Vishnu on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. One of the problems in the media in our country is that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So when it comes to international relations, we often talk about Pakistan threadbare. The minutest development in Pakistan is something we discuss on television, we write about in the print. But I think one of the areas of the world which the media in our country has almost completely underreported is West Asia and North Africa. Apart from reporting in the early days when a few intrepid journalists managed to get into Libya and into Egypt, there has been no sustained coverage of what a lot of people believe is one of the most profound socio-political events since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War. Syria has been tragically underreported in the Indian media, and what we are seeing in Syria now is a human tragedy of proportions which are unthinkable. Joining me to speak a little bit about the crisis in his country, the challenges that he faces as a revolutionary leader in a sense himself, is Ausama Monajed. Ausama isn't in Syria. He's not been in Syria since 2004, but he is very much the face of the resistance movement. The job that Monajed and the others who are part of the Syrian National Council, the job that they have is not easy, because those actually fighting the war on the ground in Syria, it's difficult to consider them as one homogeneous entity. They are a heterogeneous group of fighters who are up against what a lot of people believe is an extremely repressive government. Having said that, here in India, we have historic links with the government in place of President Assad. And therefore, India is presently treading a fine diplomatic line when it comes to its Syria policy, for right or for wrong. Thank you so much for being in our country and for speaking to us on an unbelievable humanitarian crisis. Firstly, in simple terms, how bad is it?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here in India for the first time and to talk about what's really happening. It's really heartbreaking. You have more than 45,000 got killed over the past 18 months.
Of a population of 21 million,
20,
45,000 people dead in 18 months.
2 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, 500,000 refugees around the region. The UN provided support for 1.4 million Syrians of necessities and essential food supplies. The situation is deteriorating dramatically. I mean, and every day even death toll is on the rise. And if you watch all the trends, the collapse of the economy, the hyperinflation, the decrease in the value of the currency, almost 50%, 400% the fuel and energy bill went up, and the regime is not able to provide any services or help or be even able to govern in almost 75% of the country.
A lot of people say that the biggest failing of the regime is that it's turned its own weaponry, its own army to people, to revolutionaries, people who are fighting for a change and possibly for democracy.
Yes.
But your critics say that fighters loyal to you are also no great humanitarians, people themselves.
Yeah.
They're doing the same thing.
Well, there's absolutely no comparison between a professional army that is headed by generals, army generals and intelligence chiefs loyal to Bashar Assad because they come from the same sect, the minority Alawite of about 10 to 12% of the population, who launch airstrikes, shelling, coordinated military attacks against civilians, against population, towns and villages, and they go door to door, house to house, arrests and committing massacres and genocide, and some violations on the rebel forces. You have 35,000 almost defected soldiers and volunteered civilians who are defending neighborhoods, towns and villages against the Assad forces. So when some of them commit some of the violations, which we certainly will hold accountable and oppose categorically, you can't compare the two. When you have MiG-27 and an Air Force bombing towns and cities and villages, killing about 3,000 children and 3,000 women over the past few months, you can't compare that with some of the violations.
But we still do see, and it's all there on the internet, summary executions by rebel fighters. Yeah, it's a war.
It's a video that was leaked appeared 2 days ago, and we categorically oppose it. But even though that, I have to highlight that the regime also created its own units on the FSA side,
yes,
in order to undermine and to create that kind of a misleading image of the Free Syrian Army. Now, what they are trying to do is to manipulate different communities and different sectors, which is something they've been doing in Lebanon and Iraq for a long time. But now, that being said, the Free Syrian Army, the fighting groups on the ground, they did sign an agreement to adhere to Geneva Convention
yes,
of Prisoners of War, and that's the main bulk.
But that's not being followed on the ground, is it?
But again, what is the level here?
By no side.
We're talking about the 16th largest army in the world, 300,000 soldiers, shelling and killing systematically civilians because they went on the streets and demanded their rights, freedom, dignity, and bread. And they're being faced by bullets and snipers. Snipers target children specifically in the head when they march in demonstrations, so their families will be terrified and they go back home and not demonstrate again. Those who got their beloved ones killed in the streets, we're not able to even take them out of the streets, because whoever dares to come to a corpse or dead person in the street, they'll be also shot dead. So it's the amount of grief and sorrow is immeasurable.
Are you disappointed at India for not doing enough to support your cause?
Well, the BRICS nations,
does
India,
India's opinion really matter?
I mean, there's a coordination. India, Brazil, and South Africa, the BRICS nation on the position on Syria. It used to be kind of a in-between. They didn't decide what to do because obviously India needs Iran on one side because of the oil, but also needs Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of 3 million barrels that India imports every day. But the position of the BRICS improved with the unrevocable just evidence of what the regime is doing. We have to understand the nature of the regime. This is a mafia crony regime that is willing to go far and beyond whatever is deemed, human to maintain their grip on power.
Yeah.
They consider the entire country, the 23 millions, as their own farms, and they inherited the rule from Assad the father.
But let me ask you something from an opposite standpoint.
Yeah.
This country has seen President Assad as a friend. He is somebody who has said that we endorse India's position on Kashmir. India is also worried about a lot of aspects about the potential rise of an extremely strong Islamic state in Syria. A political Islam is something which is now dominating West Africa, North Africa and West Asia. India may be worried about the shape of any replacement government that comes to power. Why would we necessarily back you, apart from the larger humanitarian issues which you've so articulately explained?
All right, 2 points here. Number one, even we in a position, we endorse India's position in Kashmir, so let's get that out of the way. Number two, in Syria, the Egyptian society, the Tunisian, the Libyan is indigenous society. In Syria, it's a very colorful, very diverse society. There is absolutely no way that Islamists can govern the same way or they win elections that they did in Libya or in Egypt. That being said, even the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria are far more liberal and advanced in their thinking than others, but they do not exist in the country.
Right.
There is no Muslim Brotherhood inside Syria since 1980, 1882. What's inside Syria is obviously conservative Muslims and not particularly political Islam. But even if they won, the constitution is liberal, it's very difficult to change things dramatically in that sense.
But is that a concern then, that a lot of people say that it is ultimately a matter of time before this regime collapses? It's a question of having a stomach for the fight, both for the regime and for you and your supporters. But are you confident that there will be a democracy that comes into power?
Of course, that's what everyone is fighting for. That's what everyone is chanting for in the streets.
But what would the nature of that democracy be?
Parliamentary democracy. We even have plans. We know what's going to, what shape of the transitional government is going to be and how we're going to go through that phase and how difficult is that phase, and the national reconciliation process that we are working with South Africa on to obviously heal the nation after all the wounds that have taken place. And that's why I oppose the term civil war. What's happening in Syria is not a civil war. It is a popular uprising against a dictatorship.
Okay.
And there's a huge difference between these two terms.
Important point that you make. There are hundreds of militias who are fighting this battle, this war, this battle for transition. Let's call it a battle for transition, if you like.
Let's call it bluntly, it's a revolution.
Fair enough.
It is a revolution against a dictatorship rule.
Are you in control of the hundreds of militias over there? How will you be able to bring them together? Or will we see a situation like you see in Libya, where you've got militias still all over the place, no law and order?
It is certainly a concern, and that's why we in the Syrian National Council are working with the Free Syrian Army in order to bring all of the fighting groups under one chain of command and central command in order to win this battle, and then later integrate that in the professional army.
Sure.
Transition is never easy.
No.
And after 50 years of dictatorship, brutal, absolute, horrible dictatorship, just like North Korea, you can't expect, Syria to become Switzerland in a few days. It is going to go through phases of hardship, phases of, try and error and adjustments and all of that. But we are now faced with two options: either or become like India, a tolerant, open society, democratic and free and promising, or Pakistan, a authoritarian dictatorship.
Is there a big worry that there is, in a sense, the Cold War is over, but a modern recreation of the Cold War being waged in your country, where Russia supports the regime in place the United States apparently has special operations forces supporting you, certainly the European powers as well.
There's no American soldiers in Syria.
All right, but European forces have a presence as well.
There is no European forces in Syria.
Well, that's what you've been maintaining. But a lot of people say that the targeted assassinations that are taking place are at least because of Western forces arming your forces.
The West is not arming Syria. Who's providing arms? 75 to 80% of the weapons come from within Syria. Either corrupt soldiers in the army, or soldiers who are on the other side, who are part of Assad's army, but they are sympathetic to the, obviously, struggle of freedom fighters, but they cannot defect, so just facilitate the sales of arms or smuggling of arms, or those who just know that the army chiefs and intelligence chiefs were just going to depart or leave with Assad when he leave or die, and they'll be left to deal with this, so that they're just going to sell and find their way out. So most of the arms comes from inside Syria,
right.
And only about 20% that come from outside, which is either come from Libya or Qatar or Saudi Arabia in terms of finances.
All right. So
the majority of arms comes from inside. That's number one. Also, you highlighted a very important point. What's happening inside? Why the Syrian struggle is prolonging that long? Because it becomes a regional struggle and an international struggle.
Yes.
You have Iran and Hezbollah supportive of Assad because of the Shia axis, that they need to maintain their access to the Mediterranean, versus the Sunni axis, the Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the GCC countries and the rest of the Arab world. Mm-hmm. Internationally, you have Russia and China on one side supportive of Assad because obviously Syria is the last entrance of Russia to the Arab world, versus the entire world. And obviously because there's no UN resolution, and China wants, and Russia mainly needs to just arms struggle the US in Syria, that's going to prolong. But eventually...
And you believe Russia continues to arm the regime even now?
Of course. The shipments never stopped of arms and ammunition and supplies. The Turks just forced one of the civilian airplanes to land in Turkey, and it was...
On that aircraft, there wasn't real weaponry per se, there was communication equipment,
Part of communication systems that was provided to the Syrian regime because the FSA managed to hit hard that central nerve of the communication structure of the Syrian regime, and that's why the Russians were providing the other parts.
Sure.
But even Iran,
right.
Providing ammunition, personnel, expertise, they used to manage or advise the Syrian regime on strategic issues, but then they used to be involved in details, and now they send even troops and forces of Revolutionary Guards.
We'll talk a little bit more about the larger picture in Syria. I just thought I'd just take a brief look and describe what India's position has been on Syria. And India has vacillated to a large extent as far as the Arab Spring is concerned. In Libya, for example, we neither backed nor disagreed with the position of the Gaddafi regime until Gaddafi actually fell. The only interest that India had at that stage, which a lot of people felt was pragmatic, was to ensure that the thousands of Indians in Libya actually left that country. And so that was a successful evacuation. But as far as a foreign policy position, we never really had one as far as Libya was concerned. Even when it comes to Syria, there is only now a gradual shift of where India stands. So, for example, in February this year, India backed a UN resolution on Syria, but said no reference should be made to regime change or the threat of military intervention. So India qualified its support to the United Nations, not taking a direct stance, but in July that position has changed. And that's something perhaps which you would welcome, where India in July voted for a resolution that sought to place new sanctions if the government deployed its forces against its population. So there's a change in India's foreign policy. Do you believe that you can convince India to do more, to be more of a player?
It is evolving, and it's very important. We've been doing lots of hard work with the BRICS nation in order to shift their position slightly towards our side rather than the Assad regime. And frankly, the only supporters now of Assad internationally is Russia. I mean, China would just follow suit whatever Russia is going to maybe vote on in the UN Security Council. I think the most significant aspect for India is, when it comes to Syria, is their position on extremism.
Yes.
And the fight against terrorism and extremism. The longer this conflict, tracks and goes on, the more radicalized everyone will be, and the we're witnessing the Islamization or Afghanization of Syria, despite the fact there's about 5,000 years of history there. The extremist groups will find just a safe haven for them to operate, to finance, to manipulate the situation and hijack the revolution to their side, because the international community is not doing enough, because there's no-fly zone, the no-fly zone is not imposed yet, preventing Assad from launching airstrikes against civilians and against the population. So whoever comes with the money and finances and arms to defend these civilians, people would welcome. They would take. You can't just ask people to sit in their homes waiting to be slaughtered by Assad regime and forces, for women to be raped, for children to be killed, for men to be taken. And you'll take money from anyone, you'll take food from anyone, you'll take weapons from anyone. And that's why we need the international support to be escalated and to be direct and to be swift, in order to cut the route and path and the way for extremists to have their way there. But the disintegration of the country is a serious issue and matter, and I think it's not in the interest of anyone, including India, to see that country goes into, or to be taken by extremists.
I'll just come to you for a last couple of questions, but earlier on you'd spoken about India's position as far as Saudi Arabia and Iran were concerned. It's an important point, and I think we need to reflect on that as well. Saudi Arabia, which is now a very close ally of ours, particularly with terrorists being sent away or returned to India as a result of this constant engagement and an improved engagement which we have with the Saudis. So on the one hand, we have an improved relationship with Saudi Arabia, who are completely opposed to the Assad regime, but we also have an excellent relationship with Iran, which is pro-Assad. So on the one hand, India doesn't want to be seen to go against the grain of international opinion, which is now increasingly against Assad. But on the other hand, we've also got our own interests in the region. So it's a process of walking a diplomatic tightrope that India is now facing. But one last set of questions for you. You must be very sad that from 2004, you haven't been able to go back to Syria. You talk about Syria, but you can't go back to this country where you're hunted down.
Of course, I mean, I'm one of the most wanted people. They will be welcoming me there, but with a bullet in my head. It's very sad, of course, but the good news is it is going to see an end, and the Assad regime will eventually collapse. This is inevitable. And Syria will be free, and we'll see democracy, certainly.
How did your own personal struggle against this particular government start? Because you've been jailed in the past, you've been detained in the past, you've been pushed around in the past, you've been threatened in the past, and you could no longer live in Syria. Tell us a little bit about your personal story.
I mean, since I was young, I was a troublemaker for the regime and was rebellious. Since university years, I was arrested first time when I was the first year in university, studying economics and business management. So
what were you opposing specifically?
I was asking questions about the oil revenues in a public finance class. And apparently, I shouldn't be asking these questions.
So that's all that it took, just a little bit of intellectual
asking about public finances,
opposition.
the revenues of oil, and why there has been no discussion of budget in the parliament since 1963 in Syria.
And in terms of the sort of Arab Spring hitting Syria, it was just a group of teenagers, right, who started protesting, and they were bullied and picked up. And
I mean, the atmosphere is already there. The preparations for such a revolution has been already underway, training of activists and so on. But the spark was the arrest of children in the southern town of Dera, where they scribbled graffiti on a school wall.
Yes.
They've been watching Al Jazeera and what's happening in Tunisia and Libya. So they just sprayed, people want to topple the regime, because that's the chant in Tunisia and Egypt at the time. And they were all arrested, detained. Two of them got, they were killed. And we're talking about 12 and 13-year-old kids. And then they were sent back several weeks to their parents, but with their fingernails taken. When their parents asked for them, and before they were released, the security chief, who's Bashar Assad's cousin in that town, said, "Forget that you have these sons, go and make other ones. And if you don't know how to make other ones, bring us your wives, and we will teach you how to make other ones." So then it's obviously in a town of Dera where pride and It's a big thing. And people saw their children without fingernails, and 2 of them sent in boxes. They went to the street and demonstrated, and then next town and the town after and so on, and the whole country was alight.
Right, a spontaneous uprising and a very, very sad human tragedy. Thank you for educating us on the extent of the tragedy in your country. And it goes without saying that people in our country are friends with the people of Syria, and hopefully there'll be a peaceful way forward in your country. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.